Let's bring in Middle East analyst Thane Rosenbaum and distinguished university professor at Torah College. Thane, welcome. So where do we go from here?
I don't know. I don't think President Rivlin knows either. It's not likely that they can actually have a unity government for the obvious reasons. Benny Gantz and Blue and White have said they're not going to sit with Netanyahu, so that Netanyahu has to step down. He's not going to do that, and most people wouldn't assume that he wouldn't. Remember, over 40% of the Israeli public, when they said, who do you want to be your prime minister, they selected Netanyahu. So I suspect the Israelis don't want him to step down. At the same time, if Netanyahu has no interest in forming a coalition, a unity government in which he doesn't remain as prime minister for the first go-around, for a lot of reasons, but most of which having to do with this potential indictment coming down the road. As prime minister, even if he is indicted, there's no obligation for him to step down. There might be some pressure for him to step down, but as just a regular minister, he's in a much more vulnerable state.
Interesting. I mean, you're talking about the rotation, about who could go first, who might not go first. This is more complicated than the Game of Thrones episode.
Yes.
But when you look at it, and then you look at the role that, speaking of Game of Thrones, the so-called kingmaker, Avigdor Lieberman, could play here. I mean, he says that he could care less. He could flip a coin as to, which one at this point would lead. Do you believe that?
Well, speaking of Game of Thrones, from Netanyahu's perspective, we have a dragon in the room. Because there's no question that what you now heard out of Lieberman is the worst possible thing that he's ever done to Netanyahu. Remember, it was just a few days ago when he raised the possibility, Lieberman, that maybe I would join a center-right coalition, provided we can get some concessions out of the ultra-Orthodox and religious parties. I'm not sure what he could have ever gotten those concessions, but he at least held out the hope. That was essentially the same position we were in April, right? In the end, he couldn't join that party. But at least he said, I might be able to. Now he's saying, I don't favor, and he was the only person who's heading a party who went to Rivlin and said, I can't pick either of these. Everyone else said they could. By the way, I read recently, or just today, 3 of members of the Arab Joint List have pulled out 2. So if you take that number, Gantz is now down to 51. So at 51, it's 55 to 51. Again, who's closer to 61? Netanyahu still has the better case. The question is, he's run out of chips. He doesn't have Lieberman, and he's the only one that can help him, except if he could peel 6 votes away, 6 seats away from Lieberman and someone else on the left. I'm sure that's being contemplated right now.
That's also an option. Right after the meeting that Netanyahu held with Benny Gantz today, Benny Gantz went and held private meetings with each one of the top members of his party, Yair Lapid, Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, and Gabi Ashkenazi. And it sounds like for Gantz, this mission is a bit more complicated than for Netanyahu in a sense, because at least the Likud party, his party, right now speaks in one voice. That's not the case for Blue and White, right?
Not at all. In fact, if you remember, Gantz, I think, would join, even with Netanyahu remaining in government, he would sit with him. It's the other Likudniks, Blue and White who would have the problem. All along, he has been much more conciliatory. I think he's new to politics. I think he's stimulated by it. Why not be the prime minister at some point? It doesn't have to be tomorrow. So you can see why there's an incentive for him to say, look, why not? This is my first foray into Israeli politics. This is a good position for me. It's the more hard-lined Blue and White members that are stopping him from doing it. But you're right. Likud has always been able to say, despite for all the realignments that are going on the left, remember all the parties merging, he's saying, we don't do that here on the right. We're united. In fact, we're all pledging their loyalty to me. This ultimately seemed like the secret to what his win was in April, but he didn't get to ultimately stay in power.
Let's go back to the question that we've been asking ever since, well, really before the election, the second one. Do you think that this could potentially go to a third election? And if it happens, who suffers politically the most?
Lieberman suffers the most. I think it has very likely, unless, again, from what Tal said, unless Gantz is able to go to his fellow Blue and White members and say, look, let's join up with him. Let's see how things play out, his legal troubles. Let's get this country moving again. We're in a good position in the Knesset. We have a lot of votes, a lot of coalition partners, including the Arab parties. If he can convince them to do it, that happens. If not, it's in Netanyahu's best interest to just call for a new election. To say, look, Mr. President, there's no way that we're going to be able to form any unity government. Lieberman has no interest in sitting with me. And then the blame game continues. Netanyahu points to Lieberman and says, he's the one that put us in this position.
Or maybe the road, to form a unity government will have to pass through a different president, not Reuven Rivlin. That's another suggestion.
Well thought of.
Okay.
Jane Rosenbaum, thank you.
Thank you both.